Coming up, part 4 of my series about fascism with liberal fascism author Jonah Goldberg. Today, we're going to look at the principles of fascism, how they affect the politics of the present. When you say the word fascist, most people's mind go right back to the Nazis, jackbooted stormtroopers, World War II, but the true history of the word and the entire fascist movement is a little more complicated than that, and it'll blow your mind when you actually know history. It is outlined in a great new book I think everybody should read. It is called Liberal Fascism. I'm joined again by its author, Jonah Goldberg. Jonah, my trail started on this with just a few things. I was reading another book. It was printed in the 1950s, and it had a quote from George Bernard Shaw, who is a Fabian socialist. I put the book down and I thought, this writer no longer has any credibility with me because this cannot be true. I went and I started second sourcing. I couldn't believe some of the history. Let's start with George Bernard Shaw. Yeah. He said the state has a right to kill you.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, George Bernard Shaw was a eugenicist who believed in wiping out vast swaths of the darker, duskier races that didn't deserve to be living. He was an open fan of Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, Stalin, all of these guys. Talked glowingly about gas chambers as this wonderful solution to all sorts of social policies.
I mean, I can't believe I didn't know any of
public intellectual of the 20th century in a lot of ways.
And he and H.G. Wells were part of something called Fabian socialists.
Right, the Fabian Society still exists today. You can go to their website. They were the cutting-edge intellectual socialists of Great Britain, huge influence on American progressives. And the title of the book, Liberal Fascism, comes from a speech by H.G. Wells, and he was enormously influential in the United States. Cannot be exaggerated how influential. And when he's asked to describe his philosophy and where liberalism needs to go, he says what we need is liberal fascism or enlightened Nazism. And he says this in 1932, and he meant it seriously. He thought fascism really was a good idea.
Basically Nazism without the gas chambers.
Right, in 1932 there were no gas chambers.
Right, okay. So. Now, Woodrow Wilson, I was talking to my teenage daughters, and I said, tell me about Woodrow Wilson. And we started looking at the history of Woodrow Wilson. Never really taught. You know Woodrow Wilson, and you're like, oh, League of Nations and First World War, and he was kind of a good guy. Not what they say about Dick Cheney. Right. This guy actually did and was.
Right. Now, Woodrow Wilson is the first PhD to get in the White House, and I think the only one, thank God. And he, if you just go by a layman's definition of a dictator, some guy who throws political prisoners in jail, sends goon squads out to beat people up in the street, creates the first propaganda ministry in Western civilization, the first modern one, sends propaganda agents out throughout the United States in secret to foment pro-government, anti-immigrant, and all these kinds of ideas. Woodrow Wilson, in every way, comes across as a fascist. He's the first president of the United States to openly disparage the U.S. Constitution, saying it's no longer relevant, we need to evolve past it and have a living Constitution, a phrase you hear a lot these days.
And he's also the guy who also, the Fed came from Woodrow Wilson. So all of these giant insidious things, he was basically, it was the beginning seeds of the United Nations. Mm-hmm. And when you look back at Woodrow Wilson, you just kind of like, okay, he's just a president. FDR, you look back at FDR, and I remember thinking, well, I mean, they changed it because he was just in office too long. I don't even know why he was in office too long. Why would they change the Constitution and say a president couldn't be president for 4 terms?
Right.
Because he wasn't a good guy. The things that he did were wildly out of control.
Right. Well, remember, he was president for life, essentially, which we never had in the United States before then. And what needs to be remembered is what FDR was explicitly trying to do, this is not my theory, he said he was trying to do this, was to recreate the war socialism of Woodrow Wilson. That what they did during the war, by bringing corporations into government and having government and corporations run society with propaganda ministries and political prisoners and all these kinds of things, they wanted to recreate that to fight the Depression. And FDR said so explicitly. And basically FDR was a Wilson retread. He was the Assistant Secretary of Navy under Wilson, had no problem with the propaganda and the political prisoners and all that kind of stuff, and that they wanted to recreate that spirit, that moral equivalent of war, in peacetime to fight the Depression, and that's what the New Deal was about.
And he had the Corps for forestry, where they would go out, and it was basically an army, which was frightening to me to read, because I have read Barack Obama's plan. plan where he wants to create a Green Corps, pretty much the same thing that we had in the New Deal with the FDR. Okay, please, America, I'm begging you, read the book Liberal Fascism by Jonah Goldberg. Back in a minute.